All right, we are just about ready to begin. Well, this should be an interesting, if not pleasant night tonight. The situation is that this is going to be a very short talk and there's going to be a lot of repetition in it. But on top of that, I have notes that are not easy to read. And so I may be hesitant from time to time, and I may have to take little pauses. All right. We are studying AstroDynamics. And AstroDynamics is a general term, a generic. It is any study of astrological influences in time, which means it's all about change. Now, as far as we've gone, we have studied the tools that are most commonly used by astrologers for astrodynamics. First, we studied primary directions. And primary directions are aspects formed by cusps in the minutes after birth. And the average cusp change is 1 degree every 4 minutes. So 1 degree equals 1 year. At that rate, a life of 90 years is foreshown in the 6 hours after birth. We did not do an extremely precise and detailed and deep study of primary directions. We did a rough study using my horoscope. And even though it was a rough study, it was pretty accurate. We didn't locate things down to the day, but when there were significant aspects, there were events, and they were important events at that time. At those times, I guess I should say. We also had, my friend Rick gave us a presentation of some of the more sophisticated techniques and some of the more modern techniques in primary directions. It was overwhelming. The amount of material that he had and how swiftly he went through it, it was enough material for an entire year. And if you use that as a break-off or a jump-off place to studying other things about primary directions, it's a good study to begin. After we studied primary directions, we also studied secondary progressions. And in secondary progressions, each day after birth stands for 1 year after birth. And since the sun moves about a degree a day on average, 363 degrees in 365 days, each year stands for 1 degree. Now, secondary progressions, which are used more often than primary directions, are considerably modern. I think they were developed in the 18th century by Placidus de Titus, who also gave us one of the constructions of the most commonly used tables of houses. I believe he was a monk that studied a lot of geometry and was interested in astrology. And this wasn't unusual. In those times, monks even made Benedictine, for example. They were gardeners, horticulturists, and they did things like astrology. But at any rate, we looked at secondary progressions, and we again looked at them relative to my horoscope. And again, they turned out to be pretty accurate. Then we turned to transits. And transits are the most frequently used tool for predicting and forecasting. And transits are the relationship of planets as they are at any given moment in time to a horoscope, usually a natal horoscope. Again, we looked at transits in my horoscope, and again, they were quite accurate. Now, when we were talking about these things, we tried to differentiate on the nature of influences. And what we said is that progressions represent things that are coming from within, from the spiritual individual working their way out into the world. Transits, on the other hand, are things from the world that are working into us, that we react to. And this isn't always the case, but it's a pretty good rule of thumb. Other things that we looked at along the way was the lunation cycle. We took that as the basic cycle of all other cycles, which went from the new moon through the first quarter, which was solar influence and solar secondary. After the first quarter, it was still primary solar influence and lunar secondary. And then at the full moon, things changed around so that the third quarter was lunar, and the fourth quarter lunar-solar. Again, I'm going to have to find myself in the notes again. We looked at the lunation cycle as a fundamental cycle, and then we looked at some lunations, new moons, but we especially looked at eclipses and cycles of eclipses, and we're going to do some of that again. That's a topic that we'll return to. In more recent talks, we've been talking about divisions of life. We talked about first in abstract, talking about the first half of life versus the second half of life. And the first you're going up, and in the second you're going down. And I don't know how to say it without repeating all of that we have done before. But we looked at life in terms of quarters and halves and thirds and quarters. And after we had studied them in abstract, we then gave them astrological rulerships and things that relate to them. And then we played special emphasis on 7-year periods called climaterics, or climateracies, if you like that kind of a thing. And we especially focused on little children, because if you relate the 7-year climateracies to the astrology of cosmogony, it can show in great detail the problems and the positives in a little child's life that can make child upbringing and education a much better thing. You get much more out of it. Then we also looked at what we call the funnel method of working our way toward predictions. We said there were some things at the very broad end of the funnel, and then gradually things worked down to the spout or the nozzle, whatever you call it. And we started talking about periods of time, long periods of time, like when the sun or any planet slow planet is transiting through a sign. If you're born with the planet at the beginning of the sign, it means something different if the planet is at the end of the sign at birth. You could say the same thing for the progressed sun, but not so much for the progressed Mercury and Jupiter, because they have differences in speeds. All right. After the funnel method, we looked at, in all of these things, whether it was progressions or transits or whatever, we looked at the horoscopes of the presidents that I have lived under during my life. That was a way to filter out, because we couldn't have time to do all of the presidents. And what we did was very, very swift and just to get a rough idea. When we looked at the inaugurations of the presidents, we didn't find anything special going on in their horoscopes at that time. Being dissatisfied with that, we looked at some important periods and events in their life, and we found that was pretty much hit or miss. And that is what brings us to the topic of the talk this evening. The fact that a lot of astrological forecasting and prediction seems to have a hit or miss quality. And we want to look into various reasons why this is. So we're going to look at 3 of those, and it'll be very quick, very light. Let's begin. Now, one of the reasons for less than expected success might be the astrologer. In this case, that would be me. So the question we want to ask is am I a proficient astrologer? And self-judgment always is questionable, but we're going to go ahead and try to do that anyway. In the first place, I don't consider myself an astrologer. I am an aspiring mystic. I do practice some astrology and I do teach it. That's what these talks are. But I am not an out-and-out full-time astrologer, not like William Lilly, who would study astrology 15 hours a day. What I do mostly is that I work with what is called judicial genethliacal astrology. And that's the fancy but a official type of term for saying that I work with natal horoscopes. And when I do work with natal horoscopes, I get a broad view of the whole horoscope first. But when I work with someone with a horoscope, things get brought down to one issue. Because if you try to do an entire life in one sitting, it turns out to be counterproductive. You make a person less interested. They think they know their whole life. They're less interested to dig in much more. Now, there are patterns that repeat throughout life, so but the patterns mean something different depending on how we have related to the experiences earlier. What I'm trying to say that what you do, if you look at the horoscope, at the whole of it, and judge it and make a statement on it, well, that person is, suppose there's an aspect pattern with a lot of trines in it. And if that person, if you make that pronouncement of what this is what it means in their life, now that pattern is going to be activated again. And it's going to change each time depending on what the person has done in the previous activations of that pattern. And therefore you're doing something very, very unfair to someone if you tell them the whole horoscope. That tends to freeze their progressive development, or at least inhibit it to some extent, which is not a good thing to do. Our purpose with working with astrology is to help people to do better and to have better lives. All right. In the first place, when I work with people, I don't consider myself as an authority. I consider myself something as a co-counselor. And as a co-counselor, I may be the leading person, but both of us are going into an investigation. We have the center of that investigation is on an issue. And it might be something positive, like how do I develop this talent that I have, or it could be something I'm having a problem with this, what do I do? And in either case, you have an issue and you work back and forth, and both people learn from each other. Now, the astrologer knows astrology, and he has some rough idea of what the individual is that he's working with, but he doesn't really know the individual. However, the individual, to some extent, knows him or herself, but doesn't have the overview that you get with astrology, and doesn't have the tools to know what you can from astrology. So with co-counseling, it's two people working together on something. So in that, I am usually the lead co-counselor. All right. Time to get back on course again. If one works as a co-counselor, the proficiency of the astrologer isn't as big of a concern. What matters is the quality of the investigation. And if a person is willing to ask questions and willing to explore things and look at other possibilities, those are qualities that are much better than having a super knowledge of astrology. Now, when we were looking at the president's charts, we couldn't do that because all the presidents, or most of them, were dead already. So it was a matter of what I knew about astrology. Now, to answer this question, is the speaker, that is me, am I proficient? And after a lot of self-analysis and looking back on situations, I consider myself reasonably proficient in understanding the major factors of a horoscope. I don't go into a lot of minutiae, and I don't go into a lot of detail. I think I do extremely well in weighing and judging the relative significance of one thing or another, of all of the major components of a horoscope. That is a strong point. I do not consider myself a whiz kid in the mathematics of astrology. In fact, I have chosen to not enter into that because it's so easy to get tricked into doing more and more mathematics in the hope that you're going to get an answer that that you weren't getting other ways. So the question is, was he reasonably proficient in studying dynamic astrology? And the answer to that is, yes, I am proficient as far as we went, but we didn't go into all of everything. We went only into the main things. Had we gone further in, it would have been into areas where I don't have a lot of experience, and my proficiency may or may not have been good. Only in rare cases do I go into great detail, and I've had mixed success in those cases. Now, all of this that we've done so far is self-judgment. And self-judgment is always subjectivity. Every day I try to practice self-judgment and self-observation, but there's always an element of subjectivity, and in subjectivity, accuracy is always a little bit questionable, it's suspect. At any rate, I try to give the straight note as much as possible and invite you to check me out. All right, let's shift our attention now. I'm not going to do everything in the notes because I don't want this to run too long again. An hour is enough. Now we want to shift our attention to the basis of astrology of any type. And to do that, we're going to use something that we've used many times before in both the philosophy talks and the astrology talks. It is supposedly from Hermes Trismegistus, who was a great alchemist. And it is called the Hermetics. The alchemy was called the Hermetic science. It is called the Hermetic axiom. It goes as above, so below. What has gone before in heaven will follow after on earth. Know this and rejoice. That's from about a 5th century classicist, and it's probably the best statement of it without going into books and books of expansion on it. Now, in the past, we've called this the Hermetic axiom, we've called it the principle of analogy. And we've looked at it in the past as analogy, the unity of the universal spirit as it works through all of the different planes and worlds of existence. The unity is maintained through analogy. And we've looked at the Hermetic axiom in that way. But that's not the only way to look at it. If we look at it another way, it becomes much, much more than that. It implies that everything, yes, everything on earth corresponds to something in spirit. This is an enormous thing to realize. This means that everything from the smallest atom to the most subtle concrete thought, all of those things in the concrete realms, everything corresponds to something in spirit. As above, so below. To conceive this, or to hold this in one's comprehension, is to conceive or comprehend the entire creation. This means that to really know astrology is to be comprehensible of the entire creation. And such an astrology is integral to the creation. It's right in it. It is its modus operandi. It is something that can't be separated. Now we humans, with our foreign consciousness, our fallen consciousness, are in exile, or we're in quarantine in this external material world. And the only way that we have knowledge of the inner worlds is through intuitive thinking or intuitive feeling or intuitive observation. Intuition is how we know about the spiritual worlds. Intuition is direct, but our astrology is only one small facet of astrology. So the astrology that is the basis of the creation itself, that's way beyond us. Sometime in the future, we'll be able to conceive that, but that's a very, very far distant future time. Now, the reason this is brought up, remember what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand why we didn't have predictions of some things when we looked at the president's charts, for example. That was our most blatant example. And the reason we're going into this is saying that any astrology that we have is incomplete. It's not the total picture. And it's sort of like you have a tool that will do one thing and another tool will do another thing. And astrology, as far as we know it now, is a limited tool. It's very effective, it's very helpful, it relates us to the greater cosmos, it relates us to destiny, but it's limited. Now, when we say things like this, there are limitations of astrology, but they're not the same thing as limitations of the practitioners of astrology. We can't use this as an alibi for insufficiencies or inadequacies or outright mistakes. We still have to maintain a high level of competency. Now, when we're working with this greater kind of knowledge that our astrology only points to now, I think that psychology, the psychology of the individual, is very important. Because if we start thinking that we're inadequate or that we can only have partial knowledge, that can be self-defeatist. So I think if we approach the knowledge of what we've just spoken of now with an attitude of curiosity, the curiosity that got us into studying astrology in the first place, that's healthy. But because of the fact that we can't know the real right now, unless we really develop ourselves spiritually, shouldn't dwarf us in our psychology about ourselves. All right. Now, so far, we have looked at proficiency in the astrologer, which in this case was me. And we have seen that the way that astrology works is incomplete, and that there are other ways of understanding the incompleteness of astrology. And that's what we're going to try to do now. Oh my goodness. There might be static because my static filter is off of my, just a second, I should break here and put it back on. Okay. Are we all right? Yeah. All right. It's always a problem when you are your own technician. I should maybe get Jerry back to take care of the technical things. All right. We're trying to study the limits of dynamic astrology. And we're doing this because of our scant success in looking at the president's charts. We first questioned the astrologer, that is me, and we concluded that while not perfect, he's okay. He does the best that he can, and for many things it's more than enough. We have also questioned we could have also questioned all of the tools of astrology. That has been done many times over the centuries. Different astrologers have tried to prove to themselves why the different tools like the aspectation and things like that, why they work. And in every case, there may have been improvements, but the tools of astrology has always come through. The second thing that we did, it was much more metaphysical. We tried to determine the relationship between heaven and earth that exists throughout the creation. However, in order to understand this, we would have to have a kind of consciousness that was much more universal and that is beyond us at our present state, except for very few people who have worked very hard and have developed a spiritual vision that they can indeed see into the inner worlds. But that's a matter of degree also. So we have concluded that our current astrologies are partial, and that there are some things that we can gain from them and some things that we can't. Now, for the last part of this evening's talk, we are going to try to answer two very basic questions. Question 1. Why do obvious and seemingly likely astrological conditions produce events sometimes and sometimes not? Why do obvious and seemingly similar astrological conditions produce events sometimes and sometimes not? The other question is, why do events occur when there is little or no astrological reason for them to occur? Why do events occur when there is little or no astrological reason to expect them to occur? All right, let's deal with that first question. Why do obvious and seemingly likely astrological conditions produce events sometimes and sometimes not? The first question is relative or relevant to natal horoscopes. Both the natal horoscope and the dynamic horoscope. From mystical experience, both first-hand and second-hand, we see humans advancing, and they advance through perfections in a number or a string of successive rebirths. We're born, we have a life, and we gain experience in that life, and then we pass on, and we spend a long time processing the material of that life, and then we spend a long time planning for the next time, and then we come back and we have another short life, 100 years if we're lucky, but that's the cycle. Now, these rebirths and what happens in them are actions. And being actions, they are subject to what is called the law of action. and that is that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Now, this is not the same principle as the principle in action and reaction in physics or in chemistry. Those are subsets of a much larger principle. Some people call this principle the principle of cause and consequence. Some people call it the karma, and those are terms that have features that are good, but they're insufficient by themselves alone. In any case, in many, many actions and reactions in a number of lives, we gain experience. We do things and we gain experience. And sometimes we gain experience when we don't do things. But that's another subject. And in participation in experience, we build character. In trial, we build character. And when we have character, we have soul power. Part of what we gain from experiences, we gain soul. And that soul gives us the power, we the spirits, it gives us the power to do new things. So this is an ongoing thing. And the ongoingness of these causes and consequences and character building and building of creative ability is called destiny. We make a destiny for ourselves. What we are is a result of what we have and have not done. And it determines what we can and cannot do. If we haven't done some things, we cannot do other things. Now, these are extremely broad statements, universal statements. They're true, but they don't have focus. In dealing with this stream of causes and consequence, different actions have different ripening times. And I have to honestly say, I had some immediate destiny this spring. I was doing garden work and I was in the tool shed looking for something, and I accidentally stepped on the head of the rake and got bopped in the head. That's instant destiny. Some things require several rebirths. Some things require thousands of years to become ripe. So when we're working with a horoscope, we're dealing with some things that may be very old and some things that are very recent in development. And often, sometimes a horoscope is mostly old things, especially if there are a lot of fixed sign activities, it's mostly old things. And sometimes it's mostly new things. If a lot of cardinal sign activity indicates a lot of new things being done. But whether it's something from thousands of years ago or whether it is something recent like to this life, when a reaction comes to an action, the reaction always occurs at the perfect time. There are no accidents, there are no mistakes. Humans make mistakes, but the recording angels who help us develop our destiny don't make mistakes. So, these times when it's exactly the right moment for something to come back, those moments are described astrologically. Now, just as we said in the last segment when we talked about that universal quality of it all, everything happens in harmony in heaven and earth. And we human beings, much as we try, can't screw it all up. Now, often an astrologer can see and understand an event and what it means and why it took place, and it can help someone to come to that understanding. However, if another individual with a very similar horoscope experiences almost exactly the same astrological conditions, there is no event if that happens. Even though the second individual is experiencing the same period. We've determined in past talks that events usually come within periods. That that if you're going through a period of recklessness, you might have an event that is an accident. And if two people are going through the same period and one has an event and one doesn't, and the astrological conditions or the description of the times for the two is extremely similar, you wonder why there is no event. And astrologers try to study these things and try to understand them. And some would try to go into the minute details of the differences between the two horoscopes. That's a mistake, because you're not because your events happen when there are major things in life, not minor things in life. There are major things. And if you've already looked at the major things in both charts of both people, it doesn't pay to go into the details. Now, there is a simple answer to this question. It's so simple that it's so simple that it's almost silly to mention it. The second individual didn't have ripe destiny. They hadn't brought enough destiny to ripeness so that they could have the same kind of event as the first person. You can pull a trigger on a pistol, but if there's no powder in the shells, nothing's going to happen. And astrologically, there can be a setup for which there could be an event, but if you haven't developed the destiny to the point that you can gain the most out of it through an event, it isn't going to happen. So, two people might be following development along similar lines, but they're not the same in ripeness. Now, this is a nice thing to know, but it's very hard to use it. There is no technical astrological means that I know of that one can tell the ripeness behind an astrological setup. You can do a little better if you have a track record of how the person has responded to astrological conditions that produce events, but still you do not know at all. There's no astrologically, there's no way you can tell. The only way you can tell at this point is by intuition. Intuition is the all in studying astrology. And you can use ratiocination and look at this cause and that cause and whatever, but you can do so much of that that you inhibit intuition. An attitude of being open and even inviting intuition is much more important than empty study. Now, this same thing that applies to horoscopes applies in a larger sense. It applies to events that affect all of humanity or a whole country or a whole society or something like that. Same thing applies. It's much harder though, because we don't have a horoscope. There are several horoscopes for the United States, and I've even dabbled in looking into that, and I thought of having a few talks on doing that very thing. But collective destiny is much more complicated, and it takes a much bigger consciousness, and it takes a much better trained sensitivity to the degree of very good clairvoyance in order to deal with that, in order to bring that out. All right. The second question. Are we all right? I always have to check every now and then, every time I turn a page, at least check to see that some of the things are going right with the technical apparatus. All right, the second question is more difficult to answer than the first. That second question is, why events occur when there is little or no reason to expect them? Why do events occur when there is little or no astrological reason to suspect them? This is a tough question. So part of the reason that this question is so difficult to deal with is it's about ignorance. It's about our ignorance of knowing why something doesn't occur, and questions about ignorance are extremely hard to answer, either with rationality or by some kind of study. It might very well be that there is a reason with the astrology that we practice now, but we just don't know it. It may be that we just haven't applied ourselves to a moment when that event happened to understand how it came about. So we're going to take an example to try to give you an understanding of why this is so difficult and what can be done about it. Major natural phenomena often provide the opportunities that we need for astrological investigation. And talking about things like severe earthquakes and volcanic eruptions and things of that, they provide excellent examples. Now, events like that are a little different than working with human lives and human horoscopes, because the Earth doesn't have a known horoscope. But the same tools that we use, the methods that we've been following for forecasting and predicting, they apply, but it's just without a horoscope. So some of the tools work, and so we have to work with them. Now suppose there is something like an eruption. Probably the most famous eruption that has been studied again and again and again by astrologers. It was the eruption of Krakatoa, that whole island that disappeared in the in the Micronesia. Now, if one looks at the moment of the event, one finds nothing spectacular. If you look at the moment of Krakatoa, you find nothing spectacular. But astrologers who have worked with astrology believe in astrology and they know it works. And so the fact that on the surface it looks like nothing spectacular is happening, that doesn't discourage them. And people will spend hours and days and years trying to dig it out, the reason for it. And when they do that, what they do is they look for something previous to the eruption or the natural event where something spectacular did happen. And the thing that is most looked at is a solar eclipse, a total solar eclipse. Now, then they take a horoscope of the total solar eclipse and they compare it to the moment of the event, like the eruption of the volcano. And they see if there isn't a connection. And if there is, they're satisfied that astrology does work. But it's almost like mathematics. They take their finding and they give it to other astrologers, and other astrologers agree that this was the astrological setup that indicated the Earth was coming to this big change. And if there's agreement, then it's the methodology and the technique is hypothetically, how did they say it when you prove a theorem, a scientific hypothesis? It's a theoretical hypothesis and it is not yet considered a law of nature or something like that. Now, sometimes, a good astrologer is as skeptical as believing. And sometimes an astrologer will find that there is a correlation with that eclipse and feels that it is not enough. And sometimes they have to look back at another eclipse before that, or another thing like a planet entering into a sign, like, that at the time when the Peshtigo forest fire and the Chicago fire happened on the same day and the same degree of longitude. That was due to a planet entering the sign and being triggered. So you look for a number of things like that until your intuition is satisfied. And for some people who want to know the truth, it takes quite a bit to satisfy them. Now, there's a parallel in human lives. Sometimes one does something with great intensity and then lets it sit. In maybe a few months or a few weeks or even a few years, they'll do that same thing with great intensity. Now, what they have put into that action is not lost. But suppose later on they do that action again and there is a tumultuous change. And that tumultuous change is not a result of that final action. That tumultuous change is as much a consequence, is the earlier two instances had as much to do with that final action as the final action in bringing the event about. So there are things like we've done like this in life. You try something and nothing happens, and later on you try it again and nothing happens, and you may do that a number of times, and all at once something happens, and that is a consequence. You set it up. And this is like parallel to what happens with astrological conditions, then another astrological condition, and another one, and then finally some little moment comes about and it all gets triggered off, and there's something like in a natural disaster. Now this is the point where I invite you to speculation. At present, there is a pending natural disaster of enormous proportion. Enormous, and it's pending. It has not been triggered off. The last two total eclipses culminated where they were right in the center of the eclipse, where the shadow, or where they're in the center of the shadow. They culminated over the same spot on the Earth in the United States. This is something that happens extremely, extremely rarely. Now that spot just happens to be where the largest earthquake in the United States, that since they've been recording earthquakes, maybe going back hundreds of millions of years ago there were greater ones, but since they've been recording earthquakes, the largest one in the United States was at the spot that was the heart of these two eclipses. It's on what is called the New Madrid or the New Madrid. Different people have different pronunciations, but on the New Madrid fault. Now, this is something in terms of astrological and destiny consequence. It could be the beginning or the moment of the splitting of the United States. There have been a lot of predictions from Edgar Cayce and Max Heindel and a whole number of other people that the eastern and western United States are going to split, and that the Gulf of Mexico will become the Gulf of Mississippi, and it'll run up at least as far north as St. Louis. This could be that. It's just a matter of figuring out when that final trigger is that is going to trigger off those two eclipses. I no longer do that anymore because I want to work with things that I can participate in. And if you're becoming a reporter of destiny and not a participator in destiny, you're standing on the sidelines, so I don't do that anymore. But if any of you would like to look into that, all the information is available on the internet. You just type in what was the time and place of the two solar eclipses, total solar eclipses in the United States, and it'll come right up to you. I've looked at the horoscopes of the two of them, but I haven't done any work with that. But at any rate, it'll keep you off the streets, and it'll keep you busy. And if you worry about things or if you get upset about things, this is a good way to spend your time. I don't know, you can't do anything about it. If the North American continent is about to split, you're not going to be able to change it. All right. Now, after listening to what we have just said, some might think there are no events without astrological explanation. Remember, the question we're trying to answer is why events occur when there is little or no reason to suspect them. One might begin to think that every event has a build-up from things before it, and from events that led up to it. And that all that's necessary is to be really thorough and dig into the past astrologically, and you should be able to find what's behind it. That brings us back to our question, why aren't there obvious antecedents? when we're dealing with events in a person's lives, we're not dealing with Krakatoa or something like that. We're not dealing with events that affect millions of people. And so it is always troubling to a questioning mind why there would be antecedents to major natural events and not antecedents to all events in human lives. It's worrisome to think that that might not be true. Nonetheless, there's a very simple answer to this question. It is that there are antecedents, but our astrology is inadequate. There are things that happen that our astrology, the tools that we have, we can't explain them, and we can't predict that they would happen. Now this is, astrology needs to be able to answer questions that cannot be answered by our current astrology. Now, the astrology of today is more like the astrology of 3,000 years ago than it is different from the astrology of 3,000 years ago. More the things are similar than are different. However, there are attempts to develop new astrology to answer this question that our current astrology can't answer, why some events are not explainable by our current astrology. And so what we're going to do for the next talk and for the next several talks is we're going to look at new advances or new tentative forwarding or development of astrology. We're going to look at them. We're going to try to look at them critically. I'm going to try and see what positives come out and what negatives that would deny the validity of new astrology. So we've had an interesting night, and this was a night that it was just meant to be a build-up to what we're going to do coming on next. We did ask some very interesting questions, and I hope that you ask yourself some of these same questions because they are relevant to your life. Thank you very much. I don't know whether we got an hour or not, or were there more. Thank you again.